Hello everyone, today we talk about Florentine history in the first half of the 14th century for our historical region series. Usually when I cover the Italian communes, I make them in one video only, right? Or two maximum. With Florence, the dam of information breaks, right? The overflow of history here is gigantic, and we can't but proceed, in fact, step by step at this point, like even a couple of generations at a time. As you know, also from other videos, I am getting a bit more to later, but specifically 15th century Italian history, because I noticed we haven't covered this. With almost 2,300 videos may seem weird, but I have a little bias for the communal era, that's true, but the condottieri, one of the signories, if you want, like the condottieri is more like the military measure, but indeed the Italian lordships really own a major role in the period. But of course you can't understand that if you don't, like especially for a city like Florence, the Medici, etc., if you don't pass from this earlier history, where the Medici, anecdotally, we're already there, for example, but we may make a video if we start making them about dynasties, about houses. We began last year with the Bourbon, etc. We didn't follow that up, but it's an idea, especially for when at least the European historical regions will be exhausted, which definitely will take a while. In any case, Florence between 1300 and 1350 is probably not much stuff, but it's just too much stuff, right? And especially so because most people focus on the second half of the 13th century, even just notionally. That's the moment in which Florence booms. It's the moment we've seen, in fact, in the previous episode of the great victory of Campaldino. This is literally like the peak of Florentine success, right? Basically, as you understand now, the Florentines will be beaten by every other Tuscan around that, however, will also fail later. And so you have this paradox in Florentine history that we already illustrated, and that definitely reaches its peak in the first half of the 14th century, of literally the richest city in the entire world being incapable of going beyond a essentially provincial dimension of power. Even though we will surely see it in part, there was a great financial control that Florence had on the surrounding communes, especially the smaller ones like Volterra, San Gimignano, Colle Valdelsa, etc. And regardless, in fact, of the Aretinians, for example, that were brought under during this period, in part as a consequence of the 1289 Florentine victory at Campaldino, you have really a veritable struggle, especially against the peasants and the Lucchese, that most of the times were actually coalesced against the Florentines that were allied with Siena at this point. Siena is Guelf. I made a couple of videos about Siena. You can follow all this in, say, chronological comparison and more. By the way, I'm coming up with more stuff about the Italian military at this point and Ghibelline leaders as well. I noticed that among conservatives and people have this more tendentially esoteric interests. There is this reviving of the Ghibelline myth, even though I don't unfortunately see much of this backed by actual historical and also traditional, but just learn the actual politics of it. It's treated like a big meme, and the truth is that this period is not properly studied by anyone, even academically speaking today. Especially from a military point of view, but I'm discovering, actually, this is probably my next field of say, my next direction in research, from an ideological point of view, because there were important divides at the time. And in fact, when we talk about Florence, we start with 1300, we do so by referring to the famous Calendimaggio of 1300. This was a moment in which a veritable schism within the Guelf faction commenced. It's difficult to unravel the social and political import of this event, if anything, because it eventually brought Dante into exile, It's also much of that, for example, Ghibelline ideology is expressed as a consequence of that. I always make this distinction. Many people believe essentially that the white and the black Guelfs, this was the consequence of the schism, were mostly, aside from the actual political and historical reasons why they came about, which we don't precisely know. At least it seemingly started in Prato, in Pistoia, in other cities, and then it spilled over into Florence. And there are reasons, of course, for this, but from an ideological point of view, also in this case, people tend to make it simple by saying there actually was a neatly defined black and white Guelf ideology that counterposed one another, and they believed this and they believed that. And the truth is that there wasn't even properly a well-defined Guelf ideology to begin with. I mean, technically, when you look at the Guelfs, so we call the Guelfs, they were actually Ghibellines. Like most of them, like the saying Dante, that was in this sense also a Ghibelline for real, so because he went on to fight for the Ghibellines in Tuscany. He was hosted eventually by Cangrande in Verona. The notion that the emperor had to be there, right, and that the support to the papacy was just something traditionally framed within the mutual support of the universal authorities, aside from, of course, all the complications of this in both theoretical and practical fashion, is never fully emphasized, right? It's not like the Guelfs did not really accept the existence of an imperial authority per se, right? And this also changes over time. Indeed, in these ones, the ideological rivalries, the radical divides were so intense and overwhelming that, in fact, even in a city like Florence, that should have simply been particularly happy with its sort of overall wealth position, reached to this extreme. And we will explain also why. Of course, there are political positions that we can evidence espousing different interpretations of Guelfism, but it's just a political tendency, right? As such, it's not there's not a Guelf doctrine written somewhere, right? Not even a Ghibelline one, telling the truth, but at least you can heavily document that on the basis of many other things that these people believed. For the Guelfs, it's another story, right? Nobody thought of, say, I don't know, the Angevins at this point among the Guelf, within the Guelf faction as, I don't know, the Germanic emperors in the Ghibelline one. There wasn't even that great attachment to the papacy as a temporal authority, for that matter, to counterpose to the emperor. Florence is in many ways the best example of this, because it was the most important Guelf commune. It was a veritable metropolis. Again, it had this absolute financial power compared to any other. It was inferior to it. And so the notion is that, correctly, the blacks were more intransigent. I made even a video about the intransigence of the papacy at this time that was also a quite iron-fistedly effective one. And so we must praise and appreciate, in fact, how far it reached. And so the blacks were fully adhering to that kind of pro-Angevin, pro-French, pro-Papal axis, right? They were constitutively about this. We talked in other videos about the Taglia of Tuscany, about the, say, Pax and the Gavenses, we can so call it, after Tagliacozzo, that I also made a video on, by the way. So I understand mostly where this derived from. It was deeply connected with some more popular mercantile, faction that greatly benefited from this enormous international interconnection. Then you had the white Guelfs that were the more moderate ones, right? And they were worried essentially about this zeal for the Angevin and Papal protectorate, and they mostly were more traditionally aware of their own communal autonomy and wanted to preserve that, right? And at the end of the day, Florence will actually, even though she will remain, they will expel the whites and it will remain inexorably black, Guelf, it will always maintain its autonomy. It will always maintain a great control on its own, for example, military, if anything, asking for support to Naples only when, in fact, as we were saying before, their same military will, in fact, underperform and require these French Neapolitan knights to come in support. There are many beautiful pages of military history about this we will have to cover at a point. And it is precisely this white stance, however, that of course points to like a commune that wants to do a bit more what they want, but also in this sense unavoidably placing the same city into a more, in fact, white, which means fully Ghibelline at that point, picture, right? And remember that, because especially in Tuscany, Ghibellines and whites fought together against the Guelfs, right? The Black Guelfs. There were some differences, if anything, having their root into Tuscan republicanism that can make you counterpose the great northern Italian Ghibelline signories, like the ones of Milan or of Verona or of Mantua, etc. That, of course, like would have been incompatible for, I don't know, Florentine prior, like Dante, for example. But that's in fact, but those are two regional dimensions that do not interfere too much directly on one another. At least at the end of today's video, we will see how at some point the Saint della Scala will spill over into Tuscany, etc. But it was a short-lived experience. If anything, it would be Milan. We will try that later on. We will see it better in the video about the second half of the 14th century. And the Black Guelfs enacted policies with a wider perspective and more in line with traditional Guelf ideology. You can even, in terms of civilization, realize that in fact the greatness of Florence at this time derived with this overall alignment. That at the end of the day, the papal, the Angevin influence on Florence did not prevent this from being again the cradle of humanism, of the Renaissance, of being again one of the greatest cities in the world, having a traumatic civilizational output for centuries to come. At a continental level, there is also this aspect of resilience. The Florentines in general, against the adversities that will essentially shatter them in the following decades because of all the defeats suffered at the hands of the Ghibellines of Tuscany, which in fact show a bit this more, say if you want to see it in traditional ideological terms, this more popular republican, in fact, tonic powers of the Guelph side, an incredible material strength, a lack of strategic initiative or offensive mentality, but one of incredible organization, of incredible. We made a video recently about the Italian Circle, the massive fortifications of in fact, the European metropolis, metropolises of the time. We discussed Florence at length. If anything, Florence hosted the largest army, possibly in the entire medieval warfare, at the siege of the city by Henry VII. We're talking something between 60 and 100,000 men concentrated in there. This, of course, was not at large like a fully operational army, right? But, of course, Florence, as we've seen also from the end of the 13th century, could field armies of 30,000, right? Even multiple regional forces on, in fact, on different fronts in a single season. That elan stops a little bit when the popolo gets what they want with at least the ordinances of Giano della Bella that we have seen in the previous video. And here, Florence starts toying a little bit more with other means, some select cavalry forces, the cavallata, affluent citizens that would join this technically, like, in fact, elite corps. Then there are some mercenaries towards the 20s that will start hiring not just the French but the Germans, which up to that point would have sounded a bit too Ghibelline. So it's a huge history. I will have to talk about King Robert of Naples as well to understand better the entire picture. But it's just like a universe on its own, right? This page, this chapter, I would say, of medieval history, just like an entire universe on its own. You can equate it to, I don't know, the Angevin Empire or the Justinian era. Like late communal Italy is just a universe that also requires much greater research, because it's just the most documented chapter in the entire medieval history. And so even just to dominate it, to handle it, you have to do an enormous effort, which many historians just do not have the competence, like the background. Like they do not know where to find the sources, how to translate them, what kind of historiography to read, etc. So looking at the Calende di Maggio schism, this were the Calende of May, that's why it was called like that in Italian. Despite internal complications due to civic resentments and banking feuds, exemplified, for example, by Vieri de' Cerchi and Corso Donati, leaders of the Whites and Blacks respectively, the intransigent faction, the Blacks, being more uniform and cohesive, enjoyed the support of the banking and mercantile aristocracy, poised to establish itself as the enduring governing party. And as such, they, again, would secure the international position of Florence. Right. This is what I was saying before in terms of civilizational effectiveness of this political alignment. Being Black Guelf at this point equates to know that practically nobody can do anything to you. Right. And even if when Henry VII will come to Italy and the Ghibellines will sort of make their comeback, etc., and the city will be besieged, literally the imperial army will not be able to do anything against Florence. Not just because of the massive fortification, like literally the size of the city. The Ghibellines, the Imperials, didn't even manage to encircle the city because it was too big, and that's why they moved away. There was this massive wealth, Angevin support to Florence that, on its own, as we've seen, had an overwhelming amount of material, logistical supplies, and resources, and this was all one with the deep intertwinement of the mercantile oligarchy with these greater powers in Europe, the King of France, the King of Naples, and more, also the King of England at times. That there will be a banking crisis later on because of the loans, of the issues of repayment. But the Florentines were actively fueling also the major wars. I mean, on the basis of the demands of the respective polities that were carrying them out. And in general, the same commune, as we've seen in the previous video, was now a real state, right? It wasn't about a mercantile oligarchy in the sense of some, rich merchant that just dealt with stuff on the market and, where another influenced the city's policy. No, we're talking an actual state in which the most powerful people are at the head of practically anything, like the military organization, the banking system, the supplies of the city, the international exchanges, the local coercion, like the force of police, right, of the popular control, the control of the district, and with actually a wide participation of individuals. Like Florence in many ways is very effective from one side, but it's also more like the more republican government of this all, and this sort of cripples it because there are so many different interests at the same time. It's a more plural, if you want, way of rule, and at war they suffer a bit of lack of unity of command against smaller communes that, however, are run by a more seigneurial, militaristic faction that manages, even also, if it were just because the fact that we're in their turn, like oppressed by this Florentine might, pressure to strike at the same heart of Florence, that, however, managed to maintain control. In many ways, just had this military shortcomings because it was not fully wanting to win, which is a major issue politically, internationally, throughout all history in many ways. Like certain wars could be immediately ended just by making a full sort of power policy rather than just awaiting what's going on and not being too much into it. Well, the Florentines are a bit the symbol of this, incredibly wealthy, but a bit, we can't say decadent system, but say more ideally corrupt or a passive system that, however, still manages to find the means to wage war, to order this, to be an actual civilization much more developed than the others, and going on relentlessly with all its shortcomings, but eventually by rising, as we'll see now also in the other episodes, as the greatest power in Tuscany. Right? Never will be actually a great militaristic power. But if you look at, as we saw recently, at the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, this is the moment in which Florence is militarily at her peak. Right, and many people get somehow confused by this because they mostly have that vision of Florence, I don't know, at the time of John Hawkwood, where they tried to hire these mercenaries not to actually spend too much for their own communal forces. That's all a problem inherent to the mid-14th century crisis Europe that we will look better, in fact, in the next episode. They think of Machiavelli and this sort of idea of a real ideal of a civic militia that, however, Machiavelli just intended in, I don't know, the peasants of Florence, in one or another, a way not to make of the Florentine citizenry actually a veritable citizen soldiery, which is the great deal. Like Europe was taking more or less like another direction. But when you look at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, in spite of this being, again, the single most militarily active time in the entire Middle Ages, you see specifically Florence in this being very strong, if anything. They had the same size of the Milanese army, and somehow this, because of this alleged prejudice about Florentine, not peacefulness, but this sort of, that let's not spend too much money for war because our mercantile oligarchy may resent of that. Well, it's actually not true. It's actually the proof that civilization must be followed also in comparison to the others, meaning that more or less all powers around were doing the same things, right? The great feudal kingdoms would do that, as the Italian communes would do that, and one doesn't have to confuse this period with the Renaissance, and also especially understanding that in between there is a major civilizational crisis of global scale that radically changes all the political, military, and social balances compared to the absolute force of before. So this is why the Black faction is so important. Conversely, when you look at the White one, there is a consolidation in this period of all resistance against the ascendance of the so-called popolo grasso, that is to say, the fat people, the richest, like this, the richest segment of the mercantile oligarchy. And indeed, the so-called excommunication of the people takes center stage, highlighting this emerging conflicts between the major guilds, the numerous lesser craftsmen, and wage workers. So in a way, there was an old model of civic participation to politics that here is being overrun by the major oligarchs that are, again, a major, say, estate, if you want. There were also the so-called magnates that were the guys that were thought to be dangerous enough to take over with, and to impose a signory, so some sort of autocratic, monarchic rule even. Florence risks this, as we'll see now, the same Corso Donati, that, and ironically was actually a black Guelf, but in many ways flirted also with other. Here you can't simply draw either white or black Guelf, like there were other communes around. There were so many factorial alignments that you can't ever draw a dichotomy. That's why it takes a bit more to learn this kind of history, because it's the real history. It speaks of the real complexity of politics to a degree that people do not want to hear, because it challenges their notion that it just takes to be themselves to be relevant in reality. Now, the white Guelphs were sort of supporting, like fueling in part, this discontent. The idea that the Angevin French papal influence now was favoring just these oligarchs within the system, that even though being a republican oligarchy were still so, and that there were lots like of sort of middle class people that were feeling crushed now by this system, and that would have provided with at least manpower to stage revolts, like city, urban battles, and even attempted coups. There are episodes of this kind, such as the Battle of the Lastra at the beginning of 14th century, with the whites that will try to re-enter the city, supported by the Bolognese that were white Guelphs at that point, because Bologna is northern, it's across the Apennines, but it's at this point at least very, very, very popular. It's one of the single most, in the sense, traditionally popular, say, republican communes in Italy. In fact, they maintain the older army system for a longer time, etc. And we will make a bit about Bologna, because it's an incredibly important cornerstone of the entire connection of the northern and central Italian alliances in general, like mostly the Guelph one at this point. The resolution of the Guelph white and black conflict delineates these stances clearly, as the success of the blacks secures the political ascendancy of the mercantile oligarchy, subduing the more radical elements of the populace. In fact, the same magnates were flirting a bit more with the whites. The magnates had opposed, for example, the ordinances of justice, which were here a bit of another thing. Like the ordinances of justice, we saw it in the previous video, Giano della Bella, etc. These were like the instances of the popular proper. That is a political entity within the commune with some paramilitary capacity within the civil, the city walls, and they were essentially trying to preserve that black Guelph orientation against this monarchic elements, and so they were indirectly backing the oligarchs, paradoxically, not the autocrats. In many ways, the magnates did not care about the common folk, but at some point they would also find themselves supporting this apparent resurgence led by the smaller nobility that was more sympathetic to them than to the mercantile oligarchs. And so you have all this complicated background to, again, for example, the life of Dante, his exile, and why he was overthrown from power and expelled from Florence as a white Guelph. Before this outcome was settled, the whites briefly held sway, however, with a series of priors, including Dante Alighieri, in fact, and Dino Compagni. The latter is a very famous chronicler of the era. And very well know Dante in the summer of 1300, being, in fact, a prior of Florence. I really can't stand when people think of Dante just in literary terms. Dante. The same goes for conservatives that quote Dante as if, they were just reading the works, but they do not apparently know anything about his actual lifestyle. This guy was a knight, was the son of a moneylender, was from the smaller nobility. He was, of course, a literary genius, an incredibly educated person. He wrote lots of other things, including pornographic literature, but he had that kind of range. He was among the spearhead knights, the breakers, at the Battle of Campaldino. He almost got himself killed. He participated to a siege, like in the previous year also in the same. He was under the walls of Arezzo while the Florentines were trebucheting donkeys with an episcopal tiara, because the city was run by a bishop, Ghibelline bishop, by the way. That makes you understand also the complexity there of the alignments. He was a prior of Florence, so the top political collegial, but still office in Florence. He had eventually vast connections. There is the debate whether he went over to Paris, etc. Like this kind of range. He fought further in the Tuscan countryside. He was in Arezzo himself later on with the white Guelf exile fighting there. It's a bit of a mystery actually where he precisely was at a given time. We find him in Verona at the Scaliger court. So it's actually an all-round man in so many ways, right? And so we have this almost kind of that's how especially liberal history was about. It's just about literature. It's about this being civic and have this almost effeminated level of zero of any level of virility of actual action and military involvement. And if you of course study the traditional imperial meaning of the Ghibelline ideology from the commandia, the monarchy, etc., like there isn't much to add. And you understand why Dante was really the voice of medieval civilization and made an entire series dedicated to him. But we'll surely talk about him as well. Dino Compagni was also a white Guelf, and he was very much anti-magnate, but he had a sort of reconciling approach towards the citizenry. He thought that there was some commonality in being Florentine citizens, also people of their own parish being baptized at the same font, etc. But this magnate elements, wanting to pursue a knightly lifestyle and eventually like repenting, breaking down in tears in church, and then going out and starting to kill each other once again. He was prior of Florence in the fall of 1301. We find this period of equitable suppression by exiling the most violent under the same white regime. By the way, Dante famously exiled his dear friend Guido Cavalcanti, who was also another famous poet of the era of the Stil Novo, who died of malaria in exile. And Dante, this was surely, like, from a civic point of view, he was perennial. Like, Dante pertains to that traditional imperial perennialistic ideology because the name Durante, as you know, means something that lasts long. It lasts, forever. These are the manente, for example. When you look at the famous Farinata, means something that remains forever. Like these were pure Ghibelline names, also with very specific racial connotations. Farinata, well, it's the most simple, the famous blonde platinum hair, but in that sense also the head of the Tuscan Ghibellines, which you want to appreciate also from a knightly point of view. There is this episode which is involving the Cardinal d'Acquasparta's mission exposing Boniface VIII's underhanded influence, from which you understand why Dante hated Boniface VIII so much. By the way, all the kind of their propaganda was thrown at Pope Caetani, especially from Philip IV, together with his Colonnese supporters. Like, these were, as you know, a Ghibelline faction from Rome. We will talk about Sciarra Colonna at some point soon. Incredibly blamed him. Like, there is all a political propaganda that is extremely effective, was used by everybody, and there are, however, some people today that do not know essentially other than the anecdote, and believe that, I don't know, if they said that the Pope Boniface VIII was all the worst kind of depravity, and you have videos on YouTube, what was the most evil Pope, like, with the meme with the Pope who evil with the devil's horn. no, this is just the consequences of having underschooled masses that believe that they are fully developed human being in the 21st century, which is a completely different thing. These propagandas were extremely effective, were extremely good, and largely have absolutely anything with the actual individuals. Boniface VIII was by far one of the greatest, most intelligent, more capable popes in the entire history of the Roman Church. And of course, he was extremely capable in the way he handled Florence. And you have the final, there is all the story whether Dante went over to Rome as an ambassador. It's a bit of a myth in general, but you know what kind of service the Florentine renders to Boniface VIII in the Commedia, which we know most of the story, at least also from the Anagnes, so-called Anagnes slap that didn't even really happen, but the coup really did. In any case, you have the final white priorate surrender to Charles of Valois. The deceptive peacemaker went to Florence on November the 1st, 1301, under secret papal directives to deliver the city to the blacks. This really happened under the sun. Telling you the truth, Charles of Valois belonged to the Capetian entourage of the Neapolitan and the French kingdom. And so these were the strong men, the French feudal knights that intervened by virtue of blood and power and prestige and feudal hierarchy in Florence to probably expel with the violence of arms the white party that was thus annihilated, at least in the city. The reason why Charles was known as a peacemaker was, of course, like the ultimate objective of establishing a black regime, which, again, would successfully lead Florence in the following decades with the full, again, international support of the Guelf axis. This led, of course, to sentences, exiles, and futile efforts by the exiles, for whom the Ghibelline alliance proved unhelpful, at least as their every offensive resulted in terrible misadventures. There is the Battle of the Lastra, there are other events like in the attempts of coup, etc. We don't even fully see them because we just know that, for example, when Corso Donati tried to take over power and was killed, there were reinforcements coming from white regimes, from the Ghibellines, but the guy was slower. In fact, this is how it happened. The dominance of the blacks intensified, countering the internal threats from their own leader, Corso Donati, who sought dominion with public support. Because, of course, many Florentines were saying, but now we're really under this guy's regime. We sort of don't have any card to play anymore, because remember, there was a Ghibelline memory in the city. The times of Farinata, as also Dante's work highlight, really were really believed, were felt. What I began the video with by saying that that everybody was an actual Ghibelline at the end of the day, because of what the role of the empire, general alignment within, also with the Germanic support that at this point was not yet materializing after generations, in fact, of absence from the peninsula, really did entail some major political and cultural directions with, again, equally relevant social and moral impact. This brought, in hindsight, also to the Italian campaign of Henry VII of Luxembourg, offering, in fact, the last glimmer of Ghibelline revival in Florence, which did not happen. Right, really, nothing happened in Florence at that time. All the exiles were outside, but this is why Dante celebrates Henry VII so much. The reason why Luxembourg came to Italy is not exclusively what was happening in Florence, of course. There was a much bigger international reason for this. Also, one thing I really can't stand is when people, by following Dante, also just make always this rhetoric of the lost cause by saying, "Oh my God, Henry VII was our last chance, but he came to Italy and did nothing." Did nothing? This guy recompacted virtually the entire northern Italy under Ghibelline rule, that since Tagliacozzo had been almost obliterated, he fully strengthened the Visconti in Milan, the La Scala in Verona, and beyond in other Ghibelline signories. He arrived to Rome, where likely the largest urban battle in the entire Middle Ages happened. Then he went this after the victorious siege of Brescia in Lombardy. There was the plague, but in spite of the enormous losses, the Italians kept providing the Luxembourg with men and money. There is Rome, then there is the siege of the ill-fated, that was actually in perspective just unnecessary. But Florence was really, like, the siege of Florence was necessary, at least in the measure in which Florence had risen to this higher symbol of wealth, resistance, right? And then you have the campaign across Tuscany in the winter 1312, 1313. Very interesting chapters. There are the Flemish in the imperial contingent, the Dampierre, that there's this enormous feats of knightly capacity from the Savoy, from the German mercenaries, from other Ghibellines in the imperial army. It's one of the single most intense chapters in the history of warfare, at least during medieval times. And then after Henry's death, that occurred untimely, as he was, in spite of all these defeats, setbacks, at least went over to was going to take over Naples, right? That we know from the sources of the time did not have enough defenses to withstand the imperial Ghibelline invasion. Henry's intentions, we know that from the correspondence with the Pope, were quite straightforward. He wanted to behead King Robert and retake Naples, because that had belonged to the Hohenstaufen, and he had to avenge the horrible crime of Conradin's beheading back in the day. So we're talking about actually one of the single most intense chapters, again, in medieval warfare, but for some reason we just remember the notion, Henry VII arrived to Italy and died. Yeah, as if nothing happened in the meanwhile, by the way. But this is where really Florence shines. Again, the Florentines basically are always confronting the imperial army, but they never take it on in open field, because they are terrified by the Germanic cavalry and by, like, the rest of the forces. They don't want to lose their own city just for no reason. Like, the imperial army is quite aware of this Guelphs. There are many, and they are good too. And just taking Florence is such a risky enterprise. The only reason why they managed to besiege it is that they managed to adventurously cross the Ancisa Pass in the Apennines with an enormous merit there of the Savoy and German troops. But there were enormous logistical issues, infrastructure, strategic limits at large. And Florence in this, like in terms of backstage, in terms of supplies, support, the centrality of the city, the aids they received, was really a masterpiece of control, of organization, of build-up. Right, it really showed, like, the full might of the Guelph civilization at that point in history. Again, this is the Florence of the Great Trecento. We'll see it now from an artistic point of view, from a literary point of view. Henry VII had come with, also in this case, we mentioned Charles of Valois before as the false pacifier, but this was with a program of peace. Right, of course, this was a military invasion of the peninsula. Certainly celebrated by those defeated in both old and new battles, as the Ghibellines, as we've seen, had largely had the worst of it up to that point after the demise of the Hohenstaufen. Yet Florence met the king of the Romans with perspective at odds with that of its most illustrious exiled son. Those merchants expressed disdain for Henry VII's ambassadors and mobilized the Guelf forces across Italy, from Lombardy to the Kingdom of Naples, to contest the imperial rights of the new Caesar rights that had been obsolete since the last Swabian ruler. You can't but understand it. You can't but feel for this perspective as well. I know that here we make traditional history. I know that here we'll talk about Ghibelline ideology in great terms, but you cannot understand. I know that the average person cannot go literally beyond dichotomies of good and evil, right or wrong, applied to human reality. It's not like there aren't, right? But human reality is, by its definition, dual and at least differently balanced. You can't see the greatness of the Ghibelline cause and success here if you don't understand the greatness and power of the Guelf bloc and what like an overwhelming level of civilization it expressed. The Ghibellines were pretty much the same. Like here we're looking at the same communes, the same cities. These were all Italians. They spoke the same language. They wrote in the same way. At large, there were important differences in art, in pioneering new visions of the world, and so on. But we talked a lot about Italian communes for you to know by this point, as old followers, what we're talking about, the intertwinement of all this, how even more meaningful, like the struggle between such close cities, really separated by just a few tens of miles from one another, and therefore being obliged to live next to one another. One of the single most international contexts ever. So a completely flipped reality from the notion that people did not know who lived like next door because it's the Middle Ages, right? So this makes you see the standing of these individual communes in such terrible fray next to one another in much more fulgid fashion than you can normally imagine. For example, it's to Florence's merit for discerning the Germanic essence beneath the Roman veneer of the empire, right? For elevating Guelfism to signify national resistance, and for enduring the imperial assault on the Third Circle's walls. Again, we were talking about this infrastructure. It wasn't even finished at the time. It's just like the great cathedrals of the era. They started them as perennial working sites would attract workers, immigrants, like they would increase the income of the city. And it wasn't even about finishing them in a lifetime. It was just continuing to work and work, and that's also why we have this massive infrastructure. As I was pointing out in that video, is one of the single most underrated chapters in the entire history of archaeology and military engineering. Henry VII, on the same All Saints' Day that had previously brought Valois to Florence, great symbolic coincidence here, 11 years earlier at that point, abandoned the unproductive siege of the city, redirecting his march to the tragic conclusion at Buonconvento, where he died, likely of malaria. Some say he was poisoned, whatever, but there the Florentines were really strong, not just in gathering this, what is likely the largest army in the Middle Ages, what really didn't take the field, because they remained concentrated in Florence. That's all what they needed to do, right? Even in some parts of the circle weren't finished yet. They were heavily fortified now by the encampments of these soldiers. The city was so big that the imperial troops do not even manage to scorch the entirety of its district, and they can't encircle it. So basically, like the say bad weather is coming in the Apennine autumn, and the army parts, and the Florentines are on their tail. They constantly harass them, right? I think I don't remember the exact place, but just next to Florence, having crossed the Arno River, the Florentine army starts bombarding with quarrels the imperial camp that has to dislodge. It's a terrifying thing. The The Imperials had crossed the Arden at night, by the way. Just imagine this in the early 14th century, all these military operations and what they really meant. And there is this enormous war in the Chianti Hills, lots of ambushes. This is actually the only place where the Catalan mercenaries that the Angevins had sent to the various Guelf cities as a garrison are actually good for something, because for hit-and-run tactics, they are excellent. And they are few, but they do really good together with the Florentine cavallata. They even attract the Germans into ambushes. They're the only moment in which the German heavy cavalry sort of finds itself in trouble. And it's just really one clash after the other. There are the Flemish that abandoned the imperial expedition at some point. They managed to break through the Guelf encirclement and get the hell out of the way. Actually, they get captured later by the Florentines. But there are so many epic moments there that are, again, I'm a bit fixated with the period, but just know that this is a huge untold chapter of history. Still, by 2025, any real scholar hasn't had the guts to take on. Right? It may be the only one that studies mostly this chapter of the Holy Roman Empire, because it's so great, in my opinion, but just know that there is space for everyone if you really want to look at it. So you can argue that in the same one conventum, the most glorious era in the history of the ancient Florentine Republic ends, right? Because essentially there will be defeats, in fact, later on, also because the Florentines are less shy against the other Tuscans. But there's never that same level of risk of sort of holding on together, like resisting, like really taking this very seriously. It's all part of the same flow, but is the peak of success in many ways. You can appreciate the ultimate Florentine victory in the war without even having fought in open field once. In fact, this is also quite interesting from a military point of view, that the campaign of Henry VII in Italy, as big as it wasn't crowned by any major engagement, because it was enough for many of these cities, as it had happened in the century, just to shut themselves into their own massively fortified position and just holding on with enormous resources they had. It's rather later that the same German veteran mercenaries of Henry VII are hired while they're coming back to Central Europe by the peasants, by the Milanese, and that's where things really get very, 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 very interesting, as we will see now. Now, the city-state of Florence at this point was expanding into a broader regional entity, because there was really nobody else now to simply challenge its position. After Henry VII expedition, the overall threat of some sort of Germanic invasion that could simply bring Italy under its control, or in a similar way that the Angevins had exercised influence on it, ceases. Right? Ludwig the Bavarian won't do this. Charles IV won't do this. We'll talk about these guys further soon as well. And Florence would, it's crystal clear, like they were doing the best from their perspective. Like they would simply persist in this inter-regional relation that would go on, like with the prescient Florentine assessment of the Italian equilibrium. You can argue, right? The Florentines understood it, as long as nothing was really changing, they could keep expanding. So if nothing was on the horizon as a big international regional issue, it was their own. But this is how most Italian communes reasoned at that point, except Florence now was in a condition of strength, unlike many other communes now that were struggling also against powers like Florence. Also, at this point, for this reason, the constitutional history shows no significant alterations. it's in a radical way. As we'll see now, there were some regime changes, different sort of institutional proceedings, but if you really look at this in perspective, what Florence was at the beginning of the 14th century will remain until the Medici hegemony, right? Aside from, in fact, these popular agitations against the oligarchic rule and the transient lordships linked to these, the priorate system at large remains that, and this is also happening, in fact, in the other communes, more or less what at the peak of their power the city-states had established as the general institutional regulation will tendentially last at least until the peak of the mid-14th century crisis. In the case of some communes, others sort of living on. Florence is an exception, if you want, because, again, it's one of the few cities that will remain de facto independent, right? The Florentines will subdue many other cities, just like, I don't know, the Milanese will so basically have just these main centers, and the other major communes will fall under them. The dawn of the 14th century set also new benchmarks for Florence's economy, art and culture. We were pointing out before, in those times, efforts were made to finish major architectural projects begun in the 13th century. The cathedral, Palazzo Vecchio, the city walls. So these are, the hallmarks of medieval Florence. You can still see today. And new ones were started that are equally relevant. Giotto's bell tower, right, one of the single most important landmarks in the entire history of mankind, or San Michele, the loggia, what would be known as the Loggia della Signoria, the Loggia del Bigallo, which are broadly considered to be the final expressions of Gothic architecture in Florence. There is a specific Italian Gothic art that we will discuss at some point, and this is very much its peak. Right, then things will evolve towards a more Renaissance fashion, especially in Florence, and that it is really the cradle of that. The economy thrived due to the aforementioned banking ventures, mostly of the Spini, the Frescobaldi, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Mozzi, the Acciaiuoli, and the Bonaccorsi families. These are really the big names of world banking at the time, who provided loans at high interest rates and high risk to the Avignon popes and European monarchs, particularly the kings of France and England, as we were hinting at before. I made lots of videos describing, again, the international centrality of Italian banking all across Europe at this point. That was all fueled, of course, by the manufacturing sectors, especially those dealing in wool. Right here, the Italians are all connected, also thanks to the Florentine merchants and bankers, to the Flemish markets, to the English wool imports, and you have just an all-round control of the wool through branches, through this most advanced levels of accounting, of banking, of just of banknotes, right? Branches, the banking seas. These are all created by the Italians at this point, by settling literally all across Europe, the Mediterranean, and controlling all the cross points of international traffics. It's estimated, in fact, that Florence alone refined and produced between 7 to 10% of all Western woolen cloth at this point. This is also because it was a metropolis with 100,000, and it had this enormous labor force, manpower, enormous wealth just to invest in the machinery. We're talking proto-industrial systems of production, like before the crisis. This is, again, the peak of the great medieval civilization. We technically don't even know how big it really was, but it was utterly insane. It's not before the 17th century Europe comes to anything comparable to this after the plague. Naturally, this required significant amounts of premium dyes, alum used as a dye fixative. The alliance with Genoa at that point to control the Lesbos alum mines subcontracted by Constantinople was extremely important. Labor, as we said, this again, salaried workers were easy to find at such an overwhelmingly populated and interconnected area of the world. This involved about 30 steps from raw wool to finished fabric that all required specific skills, competence, instruments provided by the guilds, by those who ran the city as well, from the communal councils. This is the most important aspect of it all. There is a state, right? This is not like, I explained it countless times, this is not like the Flemish towns that had fundamentally just the guilds more or less doing what they could together, right? There is properly a central institution that is the commune, and we're talking about a veritable city-state that has, again, armies of the same scale of the King of France, and that, in fact, rules like an equally large amount of wealth and resources. It's a completely different level of political and territorial control. That's why we talk about states. That's why this was the cradle of humanism, the Renaissance, and we're really witnessing the most advanced areas in the world. Commerce, banking, and manufacturing mutually supported each other, fostering a beneficial cycle that amassed considerable wealth, although this affluence did not extend to the majority of the underpaid working people in both urban and rural areas. This was completely normal. That's why, as we'll see in the next episode, Florence also was the theater, was the site of one of the major textile workers uprising in Europe that was ultimately put down, but was really scary in many ways. It's typical of Italy and central northern Italy and Flanders mostly, because these were the centers that really had all this enormous salaried masses there. At the outset of the 14th century, the strength of the ruling elite, having triumphed after centuries of political conflicts, justified the unique Florentine libertas, compared to the growing tyrannies in smaller Tuscan cities like Pisa under Uguccione della Faggiola and Lucca under Castruccio Castracani, that were the greatest enemies of Florence during the period. This is also what you want to appreciate. I mean, objectively, this is a bit what you see today with the idea that people don't like civilization, even though they don't realize that they live literally in the best system ever, because they're overly fixated with this. The elite are evil, superstition, as if the people were better than the elites. First of all, elite means being part of an establishment that succeeded, which in tradition is really the most important thing. And if the elite is brought down, it's because they failed, unlike when it is the case when they are in charge. I mean, the Florentine establishment at this point is undeniably one of the most successful in the history of mankind. And when you look at cities like Pisa, wasn't badly run. Pisa actually wasn't really a tyranny, really. Lucca really was at some point. Other cities were, like Arezzo, were turning into like some sort of signories of more tyrannical profile. But it's true that there are these strong men that are incredibly active against the Florentine rival that also are good, right? Are also really motivated, just like their own citizenry. The Florentines, if anything, are weaker because, again, there is this enormous mass that is softer to cut through, just like it is through the Florentine countryside from a military point of view, but that has this incredibly big and resilient core that you can't really unhinge. Like, so these smaller powers outside sort of have their own reasons for attacking Florence, for also fencing off her attacks. Indeed, they mostly carry out preemptive strikes of some sort, but they do not succeed as Florence. They ran out early. They manage to defeat Florence on the battlefield, but they do not manage to bleed her white. On the contrary, they bleed themselves white in the process, which brings to the degeneration of their own power. We've seen it even for Pisa. That takes a while before falling, because it was actually one of possibly the most functional regime of the entire communal landscape here. Incredibly efficient. That's also why they had a hell of an army. Tactically wise, the most qualitative force in central northern Italy, it's the Pisan army at this point. We'll talk about her military as well. And in defense of its communal ethos, not only because it was inherent to its constitution, but also as a bulwark against encirclement by such local lordships, Florence faced two major defeats. There were others as well, also some victories for that matter, because this is continuous warfare, literally hundreds of clashes throughout all these decades, highlighting the growing might of its neighbors organized under lordships. So again, the first battle, that is possibly the largest battle in medieval history, at least in the West, is the Battle of Montecatini, that, as I denounced, the Oxford, say, Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare of my eyes did not even list. The Battle of Montecatini is incredibly famous, incredibly important, incredibly big. It's more important than nearly any other battle in the period, and it's one of the first battles in the entire medieval warfare. But again, people still, like donkeys, refuse themselves to accept that there is a dimension of historical awareness that is not knowing a little thing more. It's completely flipping the idea that you had of the balance of power in Europe, and fully acknowledging that you literally don't know anything about the entire period, right? I will not descend into the details of the Battle of Montecatini. I shall make a video, just like the ones I make and discover. Like, I'm the only person that ever made a video on the topic on YouTube. This was the victory of Uguccione on both occasions. Like, the other battle is famously Altopascio in 1325, won by Castruccio. Castracani. Here again, that's what triggers me. People know of Castruccio because there is this pseudo classicism in the Anglo-American world, whereby they read Machiavelli, and so they know of Castruccio because the guy wrote a biography about him. The people do not even know of the Battle of Montecatini or Uguccione della Faggiola. Or even if they do, it's just this Groyper kind of weird notionism about Ghibelline leaders without even understanding what the context really was. Both battles are actually led by Pisa and Lucca. You would find at some point that it's like Montecatini more Pisa under Uguccione and Altopascio under Lucca, by Lucca under Castruccio. But these leaders were lords of both cities at the same time. And there were reasons why they were allied. By the way, Lucca had just recently, in the clashes between the Guelfs and the Ghibellines, and also the white and black Guelfs, switched from Guelfism to Ghibellinism. Pisa had always been Ghibelline. These people believed that they were Roman since ever. To them, the Holy Roman Empire was the only thing they saw, and they were also a maritime republic, so something very different from most Italian communes that were like also the same maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. They're virtually isolated from a geographical point of view. Pisa has an hinterland, and she's a maritime republic at the same time. She has possessions in Sardinia. She has a major international trade. And these battles have something in common. Montecatini is by far the most important. Telling you the truth, Altopascio is not even this. It's important, but it's been a bit too much overly emphasized compared to others. So, for example, in the same year, there is the famous Battle of Zappolino. People just know because of the War of the Bacle, because of Tassoni's work that's sort of reinvented the story, a bit ridiculizing the notion that is also not correct, that these communes were fighting, killing one another because of a stolen bucket. This is, again, if you don't have the entire background that I gave you here, that is even a few, right? It's just a YouTube video, but if you don't have that, but the only way you hear of the Battle of Zappolino is because of that stupid notion, check on YouTube. I'm saying really what I see. You understand that we don't live in a serious world. We don't live in a world of literate people. We've never done it, but in a sense, like today, it's worse because today the level of literacy is at least required to make civilization work at unprecedented rhythms, and people are completely inadequate under any point of view for this. But Montecatini is really a masterpiece by Uguccione. Uguccione was the greatest commander of the era. Like the guy who had the chance of scoring the most tactically developed and most again, tactically developed and complete, masterfully handled, in fact, tactic and pre-organized trap, really, against the Florentine army. There are, by the way, the Angevins there to suffer casualties in the royalty of Naples as well. It's a disaster, by the way. Altopascio is more straightforward. Montecatini is hyper detailed in terms of tactics, even just from the accounts. Altopascio is actually very plain. Like, you don't even understand what technically happened in this battle. Everything is more confused. And just a different period. Here I will not really break down all the various decades in terms of what was happening around, because it would be insane. For this video, it's already a lot that, I managed to compress the 50 years in it. However, what characterizes these battles is greater gibbeling capacity. Like, under these lords, there are sort of more... These are military leaders in some ways, right? Castruccio was a favorite at the court of Edward I. Uguccione was one of the famous Romagnol lineages of condottieri. By that point, it trained their children from childhood to lead, really, those war bands. In part, there is also the influence of Guido de Montefeltro's Pisan military reform that greatly helps, especially in the Battle of Montecatini, with this extraordinary employment of crossbowmen, lines alternation. It's a masterpiece, really. All extremely well coordinated, likely also flank attack, feigned battle lines, which is something they literally camouflage themselves. The squires camouflage themselves as breakers, as the feditori, and they attracted the enemy in the trap by getting themselves killed. Like, we're talking these moments of massive manly attributes that never end, really. But especially you have these clamorous German cavalry charges that are the consequence, again, of the hiring from the Ghibelline regimes, these German veterans of the army of Henry VII that are really, really kicking ass all around. The Tuscans really are scared by these guys that are incredibly wild. They're brutal. And in many ways, they're undisciplined, right? But when you managed, in fact, in this highly trained and, conscious armies like the Italians once had, funneling them into that specific frontal charge, man, those Germans really settled the day. Not always, right? But because also the guys from the other side were pretty darn tough. I mean, the Angevins weren't less than that, and also the Italian knights were pretty darn good. But this impetus of the German element, like compared to the Provençal French cavalry, was stronger at that point. There's a very interesting context there if you want to study the confrontation between German and French cavalry at the top of medieval military civilization as well. You have to study Central Northern Italian warfare, because that's where they actually fight against one another, whereas at this point you don't have elsewhere where, say, the French and the Germans are fighting against one another. If not, like, in a very blurred way along the places like Lorraine and Flanders, but they're not really, again, France against Germany. Here, it's technically that, especially in this earlier period that ends the first half of the 20s of the 14th century. Also, what happens after these battles is the Ghibellines pushing as close as the gates of Florence, but not managing to take it. This is a classic. Like, the entire army is annihilated, so the enemy has free sway over the enemy district. They destroy and pillage a great deal. The chronicles are very gruesome in their descriptions. The Florentine commune holds, because normally all around in Italy at this point, after a major defeat, a commune was done, right? And if you look at Florence in this case, defeats like Montecatini and Altopascio were a big deal, right? They were massive armies. We're talking 30,000 men that they routinely could keep together and field. We're talking about immense, the 30,000 is basically the maximum that say during the Middle Ages, especially in a Western context, is heavier, more qualitative, you can really field and maintain at a given time on campaign. When this is annihilated, even if you're Florence, this is a risky moment. And yet, paradoxically, this is the laziness I was talking about before, and the kind of, say, parallelism with civilization today that takes a while before, waking up, but then when it wakes up, it's a big deal. Florence, at that point, doesn't give up at all. Actually, she reinforces herself and manages basically to absorb this blow, even push further while these enemies have overly exhausted themselves. Does it remind you anything? This is why you can't but love, in this sense, even the Guelf axis, especially again, Naples with King Robert is really a big deal, right? We'll have to look at it as well, because the expeditions, that was much more aggressive, right? As the French had a bit more of a, feudal rapacity. But if you look at the Neapolitan expedition to Sicily at that point, those are massive. They're not as well documented. They're massive also in the repetition of it. We don't have all the beautiful details that, of course, the Florentine historiography with Villani and company are really the most advanced historiography in the world at the time, can allow us to reconstruct the picture. But we know of insane numbers. And this is more or less what all Europe is doing. That's also why you can look at the mid-14th century crisis and say, you know what, this is not really something like the plague coming from the outside. This system had been overly exhausting itself for a while. And Florence stands her ground, right? Of course, the severity of the military threats impacted internal governance, compelling, for example, the commune to curb its autonomy by seeking external protection. This was also normal. Predominantly from Naples, some lords would arrive for a short while, but provided with a significant amount of imperium, with a good, they wouldn't send too many troops. In the battles, they would. At Montecatini, as we've seen, the Angevins had really sent lots of troops. But let's say, if you have already, 400 knights from Naples, it's a huge deal, right? Because these are also very good knights. Florence doesn't even like them that much. Also because after 1325, Florence doesn't have to cope very much with external threats that she can't cope on her own. We'll see later that actually this will happen within the La Scala, but at that point Florence allies herself with Venice, which is also the beginning of a long partnership in that regard, and the Florentines start becoming intolerant towards the Angevins of Naples. And so that is enough, stabilizing, having especially this shock element within the city that can attack and defend, and there are very sophisticated especially after Altopascio, very sophisticated, very to-the-point expeditions to recover certain castles that had been lost in the district, led by Philippe de Saint-Genet. This was a very good commander. I would like to write something about him in the future, in fact. That was apparently an expert in citadels storming. There are some extremely interesting insight how assaults, incursions, coups would actually happen, which starts also becoming a bit the norm, right? By 1325, that pre-crisis vibe in the economy, in the general political starts being felt. All powers are beginning to entrench a little bit themselves further, waiting for the storm or something that, even if it couldn't be properly foreseen at that point, was already being felt in the general fatigue, of after all these struggles that, as you understand here, they brought. It's not like they didn't bring anywhere. Many people confuse a piece of land not being lost or a city not falling, as there is no strategic consequence to this. It's not like that, really. But at large, what actually also doesn't change is Florence's expansion on the markets and the capacity to start manipulating and so de facto controlling and governing other smaller communes in Tuscany. She's really expanding like a blob. That's why also those other communes are upset, especially those are in the surroundings. Siena was at that point, like in another reality, that on her own in southern Tuscany, allied with Florence. Okay, they were fighting on their own frontiers. But Florence really wants the Arno Valley all for herself, and that's why Arezzo, Lucca, Pisa are the main threats there. Initially, when you look at also this protection from Naples, the external support was from the looming threat of Henry VII, with a general lordship under the same King Robert. That was really nominal. The guy remained in Naples, so it wasn't much of the issue, but nominal. Like, it's a big deal. Like, as an international action, you see that this major sovereign of Capetian blood says, Florence is my thing now, to those who touch her. Then in 1325, a more defined transfer of power to King Robert's son, that was Charles, the Duke of Calabria. This was always a distinctive form of lordship, integrating the core aspects of the constitution with the protectorate, which means, as it had been historically, like in the wake of Charles of Anjou, of the broader Guelf hegemony, like they didn't have to take roots or to impose too much. This is also an interesting aspect of the story. This terrible Guelf anti-Ghibelline thing wasn't actually that oppressive. Like, the Ghibellines were more impositive, they were more authoritarian, they were more iron-fisted there, and they wanted to establish a more hierarchical system. And in fact, this Angevin lordship endured only as long as the military threat to the city persisted, which we can pinpoint in time, like just for a couple of years or so. By 1328, the demise of both Castruccio and Charles of Calabria liberated Florence from the dual threats of external danger and internal control, prompting an immediate effort to reclaim lost Tuscan territories as well, which now Florence began to do on her own. It takes a little bit, but bit by bit it starts happening. In fact, significant territorial gains or pacts formed an extensive district around Florence. Florence had her own district, but she starts grabbing these other communes, the city and their own district in turn. We're talking Pistoia in 1311. That is in the northwest of Florence. This was an important city because it was between Lucca and Florence, so it was sort of this middle ground. There was also Prato in between, but Prato's district was very small and Pistoia was the most important one. Cortona in 1332. Cortona is really beyond even Arezzo. It's very close to the Papal States. It's distant, but they basically dedicate themselves to Florence, even though they're closer to the Sienese district, and there's a cooperation there in the Guelf alliance as well. Arezzo finally is taken by Florence in 1337. After Campaldino, they hadn't been doing too much. They had just supported Castruccio and Ludwig of Wittelsbach, but there were, Arezzo is in the heartland almost of probably the precise Apennine in central Italy. Pisa is on the sea, right? So you, as Lucca, almost at least. So they're just alliances of convenience in many ways between powers that, yes, are Ghibelline, but that do not really find too much hopes for associations. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. In strictly political and strategic terms. Also called level delta, as we were saying before, that as part of those smaller cities between Florence and the Pisan district mostly, north of Siena. Now, new settlements like Fiorenzuola, for example, against the Ubaldini of the Mugello area and in the Apennine hinterland are created. The same goes for Terranuova against the Pazzi of Valdarno. This is very interesting. Fiorenzuola means small Florence. Terranuova means new land. And Terra stands for, if not castle, some sort of settlement, right? And the Ubaldini, the Pazzi, were in these areas of Mugello, Valdarno, from the Apennines at the continental side. They're the relics of that sort of feudal nobility that had remained more or less in the gangles of sort of in between the Italian communal districts, or on them, but as always, because one and another, all the districts pertain to the cities as well, as dots, as islands, as isolated settlements at times of castles, etc. So you can't literally dislodge all of them from all the castles, all the places, very impervious locations in the Apennine Mountains, but you can establish as the big city, and Florence is actually just not unique in this in Italy, but it's just the one who does more and disproportionately so can create these new settlements, these fortified military colonies, to basically watch over those guys and gradually subjecting them just by sheer osmosis, if you want, power with those guys. And they are the stronger. I mean, Florence is the stronger. They don't have many chances. In fact, many branches of these clans are also gradually subjecting to Florence in a practically formal way. Now, the Florentine ambition grew. Here, there is the expedition of Ludwig of Wittelsbach that, however, is much more practically minded than Henry VII. The guy just wants the Holy Roman Imperial crown and then goes back to Germany. He sort of tries to besiege Milan after having, those were technically to be his own allies. But he tries and then comes back to Bavaria and has a prosperous life there. We talked about it in video about the Duchy of Bavaria. And so Florence, yes, is annoyed. There is this other expedition, but it's not as big as Henry VII's. All right. And Lucca is the next major rival to take out, because if you take Lucca, you can, first of all, have an access to the sea north of Tuscany. Florence here, as a massive metropolis, did not really have an open to the sea, if not through the Siennese territories, that were also contended with Pisa on the coast. There are some battles. The famous fresco of Guido Riccio, for example, da Fogliano, is a testament to the wars that Siena was carrying out, as we've seen in the relative video, to storm those rebel strongholds that were siding with the peasants next to the sea, like Massa, for example. Also, if you have Lucca, you're just a couple of kilometers, tens of kilometers away from Pisa. So you really have a major upper hand. You can sort of thwart most Pisan offensives. And so there is, but it's also distant, right? There are other powers that interfere with this Florentine aims, including the same Pisa, as you understand. Florence in this erred by rejecting the offer from Bavarian mercenaries that had entrenched themselves on the Cerullo hill outside of Lucca to sell the city that they had kidnapped after Castruccio's regime fell. This would happen, like some Bavarian mercenaries that had defected from the Bavarian army that was very divided. There were the northern and the southern Germans that were really arguing all the time, literally also about the papacy in the empire. Like some of them were sort of more pro-Guelf, pro-papacy, the others were more pro-empire. Very interesting, so I want to write on that as well at a point. At some point, the Wittelsbach's expedition melts away along the way, and some of these guys find Lucca with this vacuum of power and literally hold it for ransom, right? Castruccio was dead. In 29, lots of great leaders of the time died. Cangrande, it's a bit like the end of an era. And at that point, Florence was offered I don't remember the price actually, but it was a pretty small one overall. Lucca was a middle-sized city. It was a very good offer, but the Florentines say no. And Villani, this major chronicle of the time that witnessed all this as an official of Florence as well, says, you're demented, because later Florence would go for it at a much higher price. And at this point, by the way, the Florentine capture of Lucca would have much more secured Florence's position there. Instead, this this ends, and the Della Scala infiltrate Tuscany from that direction, not only. And Florence will only later buy Lucca at an inflated price from Mastino della Scala, the lord of the nephew of Count Grande, Lord of Verona, that by this point had created a massive dominion across northeastern and central Italy that was aiming to threaten Florence, as we will see now. And in all this, Lucca, by the way, had changed hands multiple times. I'm not even going to recount this. We will make surely a video about Lucca, probably soon. By the way, this misstep of buying Lucca, especially at that point, sparked conflict with Pisa for the aforementioned reasons. Naturally, Pisa was envious of this acquisition because, as we've seen, they had been partnered with Lucca for a while. Ghibelline had been fighting against Florence, and the two cities had shared this bond against a common enemy. And this rivalry between Pisa and Florence transformed the Lucca endeavor into a debacle for the Guelfs, significantly undermining the Florentine establishment. As basically there is another battle, a major one, the Battle, in fact, of Lucca, that, as Green says, like it passed down to history without even a name. And it's actually one of the largest battles of the era as well, that for no reason people did not study at all. But it's big and also very well documented, about tactics. It's a great battle. There's an incredible resistance of the Pisan infantry and crossbowmen that they keep at bay, that the Florentine cavalry. It's amazing, really. Incredibly complex and big battle. Multiple lines in depth, crossbowmen on the wings, very hard entrenched positions as well, up to the Pisan-held hill, risk of flank attacks, etc. And the Florentines get defeated, humiliated. This is a very big defeat, and possibly a much more consequential one than Altopascio, for sure, like also in absolute terms, but also in terms of say Montecatini, because if you look at the relative consequences of this brings to major upheavals in Florence. In fact, it's at this point that the Florentine establishment had already an eroded economic base, and it's in parallel with this defeat that the collapse of major banking houses like the Peruzzi and the Bardis happens, making, by the way, the same ruling elite more open to accepting a temporary foreign lordship under Walter of Brienne, the Duke of Athens. This was the son of the guy who was killed by the Catalans at Cephissus. We talked about him here and there. This unfortunate signory of Florence that lasted just for a year or so. The guy would, by the way, get killed at the Battle of Crécy, together with the son of Henry VII, John of Bohemia, the father of Charles IV, that, by the way, had intervened in Italy at this point, doing sort of fairy tale mercenary tour, right, of the countries, financed by this point only by the Italian community. I mean, basically nobody was entering anymore if it wasn't like a local city paying for it. That was the case of Brescia, by the way. So many weird things start happening, and one must study the period well to understand what was going on. By the way, the start of the 100 Years' War revealed King Edward III of England's bankruptcy, to whom many Florentine bankers had extended substantial credit, triggering that domino effect of financial ruin detrimental to Florence's economy. The Florence of the Medici is not the Florence of this period. Like, the former one was much richer, right? With the Medici, you have just a signory that controls all the banks of Florence, making them the unprecedentedly richer bankers ever, but not because the absolute amount of wealth was there in the same way, right? There were many more autonomous bankers in Florence up to this crack. That wasn't even just about a specific date. This is again the great medieval civilization starting to collapse. The Mozzi, for example, failed in 1311, the Scala in 1326, and on November the 4th, 1333, a catastrophic flood obliterated 3 of the 4 Arno bridges. Consider that there was a major flooding in Florence, even up to, I don't remember, I think it was in the 60s of the 20th century. Just imagine in medieval times what this really meant. We know the massive amount of destruction. This carried away also the ancient statue of Mars, that if you remember the first video we made was the tutelar deity of Florence. And this was really seen as a foreboding sign, considering that that's also the divinity, at least of a more warlike approach to politics. Between 1342 and 1346, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, and the Bonaccorsi sequentially went bankrupt. This was the major deal. We are just one step away from the Black Death, by the way. Yet the magnate families preserved some of their wealth by converting it into land and fortresses. This is really typical of the era. During the mid-14th century crisis, the major investment is away from the financial markets into real estates, if we can so say. In response to the near collapse of the social order, that again was incredibly straining. I can't stress this enough, because we don't see it in comparison to other big events like they're much more eclatant. Again, the Battle of Montaperti, the Battle of Montecatini, so there's major defeats for Florence. But it's actually these events that undermine the very fabric of Florentine absolute power, not relative one, because actually Florence is increasing in power all around. Also because this is the other lesson about civilization and crisis. When there is a crisis, yes, it seems like the bigger civilization suffers in a more grandiose way, but it actually it's the actor that remains better on its feet. Right, the others, the smaller systems, are not profiting from the crisis. Actually, they're the ones that are suffering it the most. And it's where there is a previous civilization that the bases are sound, all right? Or at least they're sounder than the others. And so that's when governance is handed over to this known French noble, Gautier Walter VI of Brienne. Also known, again, as the Duke of Athens, not because he had actually ever ruled in Greece. Actually, he had to escape after his father's death from Greece, as he was a child with his mother, but because he always tried to recover Athens. Walter's history is a history of complete failure in every endeavor. It's a very tragic figure. It's also a very interesting one. We'll talk about him one day. The guy had, by the way, just for telling you what kind of entourage the Angevin Napoleon was, he had been in Florence with Charles of Calabria in the years 25-27. So it's all this enormous French Angevin axis that stretches from the Channel to Greece that passes, of course, also through Florence, that is also very affected in its patrician elite, etc., by the French ways, etc., vice versa. This will be typical. Think about the marriages between the Valois and the Medici later on. Different estates, but the same level of wealth, of say, elite background, of sophistication, and so on. Now, the military crisis usually necessitated such lordship experiments, as we've seen, but this time, after the Battle of Lucca, it was complicated by the deterioration of the same establishment and the agitation of both the lower estates and the magnates, who were more disposed to accept tyrants' rule over, say, estate division, leading to a unanimous demand for Walter's lifelong lordship at the Parliament on September the 8th, 1342. This would be an incredibly short seigneury instead. Walter was essentially backing the people to follow a sort of populistic attempt, because he thought that the Florentine ruling establishment was sort of done for. Instead, he was very wrong about that. It wasn't even fully for the people. These were some of the single most noble houses of Europe, right? What did a Brienne have to do with, Florentine people, right? Very few, right? And there is surely some cultural misunderstanding there. I mean, the Angevins, as we've seen, knew Florence well, and they had been able to treat it. But now, in the 40s, it's different. The Angevins aren't even quite there. Brienne is chosen, yes, because it's part of the entourage, but not because there is this full mandate from Naples. The Florentines basically do it by themselves. Actually, they're trying to defile themselves from the connection with Naples because it feels toxic to a degree, and Florentines are starting to do a bit whatever they want, as also the ill-fated Lucca enterprise showed. The priors of Florence only agreed to a 1-year term before this lifelong lordship demand was done the year after. And in fact, the conditions for Walter were the same ones used by Charles of Calabria. Walter's actions quickly led the Florentines to rue their decision, as they grew intolerant of his capricious behavior, overbearing initiatives, and pompously chivalric demeanor. The Duke of Athens took residence in the Prior's palace and initiated an extraordinary regime of despotic governance in Florence, which, with public support, was intended, again, to introduce an equality principle unknown to the commune. Just to tell you how actually traditional and aristocratic the communes really were. They would have never tolerated the average person to be there. But it was, again, a purely, in fact, populistic nonsense that quickly brought to the end of this lordship. Other lesson from civilization: never think that you can give civilization or the establishment for granted. And this leveled the status of the marginalized with that of the politically enfranchised elites, at least in the Duke of Athens' imagination or wishful thinking. It wasn't he's a very interesting figure. It's not like an idiot, but he dared a lot, actually too much. Seeking to distance himself from the magnate estate that had brought him to power, other, not advisable thing, Walter began to enact policies slightly favorable, because it's also, again, couldn't be done in a democratic sense in medieval times, like to the lower classes, let's say, likely to cultivate his own independent base of support, which also failed. Other umpteenth lesson from civilization crisis: during civilization crisis, never bet on the people, because they are the ones who are going to go down anyway. So the lower populace, particularly the numerous workers from the wool guild, the Ciompi, that we will meet especially in the next chapter, were indeed excluded from the guild system. That had been the main issue, as you've seen at the beginning and in the previous videos, that the guilds were run just by the so-called fat people, so that the very oligarchs of the situation that controlled the smaller guys, that were thus barred from political engagement and earned barely sufficient for survival, often depended on aid from hospitals and the city's charitable organizations. The Florentines consumed a disproportionately large amount of wine, of food. Florence was that opulent, even in times of crisis. And so there were lots of hospitals that helped the poor. And, this dispossessed masses would find some sort of parasitic way of survival in there. Yet, Walter had negotiated his lordship with the most desperate factions, those from the former oligarchy, anxious to vanish during a period of heavy accountability, the old magnates keen on eradicating the ordinances of justice. They were still there to harass them. And in fact, the lower people, the lesser people, adversaries to the dominance of both groups. And so when you actually look at Walter's lordship better, you realize that he was just trying desperately to remain in charge, equilibristically districating himself within a too thorny of a political entanglement. which is again not a good recipe for success. Especially the latter. Again, this sense of let's abolish the ordinances of justice, because this had traditionally protected the popular government that the same oligarchs represented, not properly the lesser people, and so because that had been again the popolo in opposition to the magnates, right? So this approach was the final straw for the fat people, who had initially given Walter control of the Balia, which was also like a tribunal there, a council that arbitrated, in fact, on various very important political legal issues, but soon grew wary. They had given this mean for supporting them, and now he was wanting to bar the ordinances of justice. What? And this, in fact, led to plots against Brienne, culminating in multiple independent actions that resulted in his overthrow and escape on July the 26th, 1343. During the Feast of Saint Anne, a date etched in Florence's history as one of celebration for the restoration of the Libertas. In fact, Brienne was besieged in the public palace, and literally they held out for a while, he and his knights, etc. But at the end of the day, they had to give up. Many of them were killed in the streets. Like, it was a very gruesome spectacle, and the Duke was expelled. The dramatic ousting of the Duke of Athens was, by the way, immortalized in frescoes. One I use for my pictures about 14th century warfare. That is Andrea Orcagna's, this is the actual title, The Expulsion of the Duke of Athens, that is in the same Palazzo Vecchio. It's now mostly lost, but you can still see in the image the broken sword. It's an allegory, and the guy there kneeling on it is the Duke of Athens. The Orcagna is a later author from the era, but still close to the times. So the lordship couldn't establish itself until the factions were completely drained. This was particularly evident in Florence. That was such a strong republican and popular regime. So you couldn't simply affirm like some sort of autocratic tyranny like in Milan or Verona. It was a completely different reality. It may seem like the ordinances of justice were just, again, a few time away. Just imagine 50 years ago, right? But the world has so much changed by this point, right? It was just a completely different balance holding the reins of it all, and it seemed like forever, like this system had been now ingrained. It couldn't really be touched in many ways, so that the lordship would take a long time to come in Florence. It was really the furthest from a lordship a regime could be in Italy. This is, I would say, very meaningful as well if you look at it. Like, there is a principle of citizenry, of establishment, of like the better people ruling, but also in a very plural fashion. So reflect about this when you think about where does Florence come from, because as we've seen in other videos, Milan came from very different background. I mean, they were stronger, they had a much larger dominion, they could even unify the Italic kingdom. Florence couldn't, never could, right? It wasn't ever a moment in which she could, but she somehow provided with a model of leadership and of government and of civic culture that I think has a radical impact in the world still to this day. Well, it did stem from this in many ways. It would take several more decades of unproductive conflict for the Medici to eventually take over, and also for particular reasons in the same city and abroad, right, that we will see when we arrive at that point. We can characterize this period thus because after an ineffective attempt at social harmony through the Balia of the 14, these were some councils that were instituted, were making things simple, by the way. The way that the communal government worked was very complex. But say this Balia was very important because it had shared representation between the elite and commoners. After decisively crushing the remaining hopes of the magnates that were a bit the big defeat in this, permanently sidelining them from politics, the struggle intensified between the two popular factions of the major and minor guilds, especially because of the blow that the former had suffered with all those banking cracks that had brought, again, the lower system to sort of re-emerge with a popular force. These factions were, as we've seen at the beginning of the video, in conflict since the division between whites and blacks within the Guelf party, oscillating between these popular pushes and oligarchic responses, neither managing to secure lasting governance nor preventing the inevitable decline of a divided and weakened estate. Right, following Walter's ouster, unrest escalated, with the first riots breaking out in the autumn of the next year. In fact, this was actually the most important consequence of the Battle of Lucca. A veritable regime change in Florence. This swiftly, so there were some uprisings that were swiftly quelled, but the discontent remained. The main consequence was, however, the affirmation of a more popular regime through the aforementioned councils that sort of was balancing out this power strength relation. Not much changed really in the way the city was run, by the way, but it was important because it's as if there had been, I don't know, a populistic or popular uprising of some sort. And again, when I say popular here, I really intend it in the Italian sense. It is something different from the salaried workers, the Fourth Estate. We're talking about sort of citizenry in a concrete, politically participative sense, which most of the people did not have, really, because they were not considered citizens. They came to work in the city, but they weren't citizens. Just months later, in May 1345, Ciuto Brandini, a carder from the northern artisan neighborhood of San Pier Maggiore, came to prominence. Ciuto attempted to rally his fellow workers through strikes and assemblies in the city's streets, Piazza Santa Croce and the Loggia dei Servi di Maria, but his endeavor to form a brotherhood, quote-unquote brotherhood, among workers and artisans collapsed. This was the populistic response beyond, again, the people, but among these dispossessed. Ciuto was arrested along with his sons on May the 24th, 1345, judged by the Podestà of Florence, and soon after sentenced to death by beheading. This gives you an idea of how traditional regimes, even in a commune, and the most popular Republican one, really understood the Fourth Estate. Ciuto's actions prefigured, of course, the much later Ciompi revolt by over 30 years. We're in 1378, we'll see it in the next video, but it does give you a dimension of the malaise that this Fourth Estate was perceiving at the time, and the fact that they were hoping themselves for some kind of broader agitation. They realized that if they could cripple the Florentine textile production, they could have a massive leverage on the same city politics, except just like with the Jacquerie, we were in more or less in the same years, it was the same period of those revolts, also in Flanders, etc. They didn't have any real cohesion. They didn't really have any real long-term plan, right? It was just seeking this rebellion, but not really managing to achieve it in a functionally lasting sense. And this first failure, by the way, should have already showed a lot. It's meaningful that the Ciompi revolt happened so late in time compared to this, because this was like the heat of, like, it was not full crisis, but as we've seen, these were incredibly tumultuous times. In any case, the elites would be reinforced with the crisis. Now, the fat people were, by the way, now more inclusive towards magnate families who had performed notable services for the Republic, skillfully used the situation to consolidate power entirely in their grasp. This was, of course, due to the fact that these magnates now were ridiculously identified as such. I mean, they were just families who were very powerful. They were generally speaking barred from that political participation, but could be co-opted if they had been loyal to the Republic, if they had served some purpose, because they were still citizens of Florence, right? But they couldn't do more than much in the city. Naturally, this was a very different time from the one of Corso Donati that had literally tried to make a coup in the city with a major urban battle with foreign forces entering to betray. This was really, it's not like it would have not been feasible at this point, but let's say as we've seen, the fat people establishment was much more confident about its entrenchment, and especially the general Florentine dominance in the region, in the surroundings, was now making the same magnates much more dependent on the same communal government. So it would have not made much sense for them to try a coup, right? It would have just been able to rise to power by themselves within the group that by now in Florence was the only way to rule every once in a while. The priorate lasted like 2 months. It was almost ridiculous. Imagine, elected government now lasting 2 months. But that's how and it was even effective to a degree. I mean, as we've seen, all those Florentine defeats at large depended also on this incredibly, complex political machination and alternation. But however, it was still effective. Again, what Florence managed to achieve here throughout this decade was nothing short of astonishing, resisting to all those blows, expanding further, having this all internal readjustments because of the necessity of the era, let's say the generation of the times of the world, but still holding a hell of a government, a hell of a city, a hell of a power. In this year's governance was decided by the Gonfaloniere of the Giustizia of Justice, plus the 8 guild priors, the Council of the Buonomini actually, which means the Council of good men, of people worth of faith, and so it's a combination. This is the communal government in itself. You see, these are communal institutions proper, right? And there is also this Council of the 16 Gonfalonieri, the Gonfalon bearers, the Gonfalonieri of the Compagnia. These were, we'll actually have to look at these things more in detail, but just to make long story short, this 16 were 4 per each newly delineated district of the quarters, further divided into 4 gonfalons for tax and military purposes, though the reliance on mercenary forces in the city was increasing greatly. So this was sort of an extra spurt of that popular uprising, creating more paramilitary forces on the basis of the local district, etc., and not going much elsewhere for that matter with that, but still owning a place in the government. As you understand, it's a very complicated story, one that you need a bit of time and definitely some greater sense of context, because I don't know how long this video lasted. Let's see it now, but believe me, it's not easy to talk about this stuff. It's a lot of stuff. There are people who spend their entire life even just in this 50 years, and like most Florentine documents of the major Florentine archives, we're talking a labyrinth. Nobody has ever entered it. It's as if you had one of the most important funds in the entire world, and nobody could enter that because objectively you must have a progressed competence in all the technicalities of of these sources that if you don't, you sort of don't even know where and how to start with them. It's objectively insane, and imagine having to condense this in a couple of hours, like now. Florentine history is important beyond what most people really understand. It's I don't know how many. I don't know. Maybe I've been doing this Florentine series for long, so that I kill the initial hyper interest or whatever. But just remember, these chapters are like, if you grasp this, you grasp a great deal what was going on in Europe at the time, because as we've seen, the entire picture tried to revolve around securing at that point control in Italy under Henry VII by conquering Florence. Right? Had it succeeded, like as a military enterprise, we would live in a very different world. Just like the expedition against Naples, it was actually much more feasible. I mean, it was much easier to conquer a major feudal monarchy, a major regional power, than a city by actual absolute scale of power. Also in terms of manpower, of resources. There are reasons for this as well. I still have to make good videos about the Neapolitan kingdom during this era, because again, King Robert's reign is incredibly underrated, and we will surely try something of this kind. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.